So, Matt, this is a very special episode. This is the first time we're talking about a trip away that we took. But first, I want to talk about, not only did we learn a lot about Jessie Knight, we also learned a lot about each other. Mainly that you are on a recording of Top of the Pops in the crowd for The Offspring.
Yeah, I mean, that was the Top of the Pops recording for The Kids Aren't All Right, I think, when that came out. And they did they also like wheeled out some Christmas trees. I think we recorded it in the summer, and they wheeled out some Christmas trees and recorded the Christmas Top of the Pops episode showing of Pretty Fly for a White Guy. Yeah, in like whatever year that was, 1999 or something. Maybe
1999.
Yeah,
when I was 4.
Yeah, and I'm there like with pink spiky hair, rocking out at the front.
But you know, it is a testament to how you've aged like a fine wine. The fact that you look pretty much exactly the same, though it's like a 2-second window of your face of you rocking out, like you pretty much look the same. But I do want you to tell me about your, what was it, 34 or 36 inch opening jeans?
Yeah, well, you know, like as I was saying to you, it's amazing that baggy clothes are coming back in, because when I first went to uni in 1998, and you know, the reason I'm still in tons of debt now is because they gave us all a credit card with like no credit card checks, like literally on the day you started uni. Like, who could have seen that 2008 financial crisis coming a decade later? And one of the first things I started doing is ordering ridiculous clothes from the United States, and I bought jeans that had 32-inch leg openings, not waist, but I am about a 32-inch waist. I was a bit skinnier then, even probably closer to a 30-inch waist back then, but the leg openings were 32 inches. Yeah.
I mean, multi-use jeans anyway. You could have put them on like the proper way. You could have put them on with like one of the legs sticking up, you know.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, you know, they were like wicking up water from the floor. It was just absurd, really. But you know,
I mean, look at you're a fashion icon now. I cannot say the same about my youth. I dress terribly, and to some extent still kind of do, but I dress very basic. But yeah, so we went to Wales yesterday for a very, very special trip. What did we do? Let's talk about it before we get into the main topic.
Yeah, well, so I got up at what, I got off the train at 5:30, and we got to Wales about 10 o'clock, and we went to the National Museum of Wales. So some people who know what I do may have already seen, but I did an exhibition called British Tattoo Art Revealed at the National Maritime Museum in Cornwall in Falmouth back in 2017. There's actually, again, a smaller version of it still at the museum in 2023. So if anyone's sort of in Cornwall, in Falmouth, you can pop in and see a sort of smaller version of the show, including some of Jessie's stuff, actually. But as part of that exhibition, I got in touch with a guy called Neil Hopkins Thomas, who was the great nephew of this really incredible tattoo artist called Jessie Knight. So she was, as we'll talk about, she was like the first kind of prominent female tattoo artist in Britain. I wasn't the first person to talk about her or even to get in touch with Neil. There's a little bit about Jessie and a little interview with Neil in Margot Mifflin's book, Bodies of Subversion. But no one had really seen her collection for, since she retired. She retired in the late 1960s. And I sent Neil via Facebook, tracked him down, sent him a message basically saying, hey, we're putting on this exhibition. I wonder if we could borrow some stuff. I hear you've got some material that belongs to your great aunt. And he said that thing that, you know, historians like me, you just long to hear, which is, yeah, I've got a few things in the loft, right? And
cash in the attic.
Cash in the attic. And the few things in the loft turned into, you know, between sort of 700 and 1,000 individual items of tattoo flash, tattoo photography, tattoo machines, incredible objects, not just from her career. Again, as we'll talk about, she was tattooing from the 1920s, and really mainly from the 1940s through to her retirement in the late 60s, but also from her father's career. Her dad had been a tattooer right back to the turn of the 20th century. This incredible archive of beautiful things, all completely intact, almost like the day she had retired tattooing, she'd packed it all up and put it into plastic bags or sports holdalls, and it had, ended up in the family and ended up in Neil's loft. And we sent a van down to Cornwall, and Neil was very kind and brave to let us take the whole collection to Cornwall and go through it. And yeah, we'll talk more about the story of how it ended up in Wales, I suppose, as we go through this conversation. But this is where it began, right? To start off, maybe just to kind of give a sense of what we're talking about here in terms of a collection. There was some of our listeners, many of our listeners may have heard of this really interesting, important British tattoo artist called Ron Ackers, who tattooed in Portsmouth for a long time, was really one of the people really instrumental in connecting the British and American tattoo scenes in the post-war period. He was a very close correspondent of Lyle Tuttle's. He was a correspondent of Ed Hardy's as well in the 70s. And Ron, before he died, wrote a little sort of autobiography. It's very hard to get hold of. But there's a little chapter in it about Jessie. And this is, I think, a beautiful introduction to what we're going to talk about today, because he says in his chapter about Jessie, one of my early recollections is that when tattooing, she used to sit on a big old trunk, rather like a wooden seaman's trunk with handles either side of it. Naturally, she was always being asked what was inside the trunk, and she would reply, "One day I'll show you." When the day came that she was prepared to show me what was in the trunk, I found it was full of old tattoo designs, old machines, old photographs, and other bits and bobs associated with tattooing. She reckoned to have had the trunk since she first started up in the 20s, and it had been everywhere with her. She had a large roll of canvas, which she used to put up in every shop or booth she worked in. The canvas had been painted in oils by her father with tattoo designs all over it. Needless to say, I was very taken with this and tried for many years to get hold of it, but there's no way she'd part with it. And the contents of that trunk, minus that banner, which maybe we can talk about again as we go through, are now in Wales. They're now held for the nation, saved for the nation, at the National Museum of Wales, and that's what we went to go and see yesterday. So, yeah, the trunk itself no longer exists. In fact, there was, I think, one of the reasons why the collection hadn't really been chased down is there were persistent rumours that the trunk had been destroyed, with the understanding, I think, on the grapevine that what was in it had also been destroyed. But actually, I don't know what happened to the trunk. One of the stories I heard was that it was just simply too big to fit into Neil's loft. But he did keep the collection and the contents of that trunk safe from her death in the 90s. She died in 1992, right the way up until I sent him those Facebook messages in 2016. And yeah, this is what we went and saw yesterday. So Ron Ackers was desperate to get hold of this material. Couldn't believe it, what he saw, and she didn't show it to anyone, but now you and I went to see it yesterday. So yeah, I don't know. We've talked about this already on the other feed. We'll be putting out some other sort of things that we filmed on site, recorded on site yesterday. But yeah, do you want to talk a bit about seeing, in some sense at least, the contents of that trunk?
Like, it was mind blowing, to be honest. Like, seeing the breadth of not just designs that had been flash designs up on the wall, but I know I've said it on those other recordings, which will be coming out soon, but seeing kind of the totality of someone's life and career captured so well in the objects that they kept. She, took studio photography of tattoos she had done. She had tattoos she had pictures of tattoos other people had done, pictures of herself, pictures of her friends. And it was just really fascinating to see the life of someone who is very important to tattoo history that most people don't know about before it's kind of released to the public, and seeing all these little tidbits, and the fact that all of almost everything that has two sides was drawn on both sides or notes scribbled on it, and you can see so much of her personality coming through on stuff. I saw kind of composite material boards where it's there's flash on one side, then there's like sketches of the Flash on the other side, and like she'll have like a little note down about like, oh, I need to change this or change that, or even just like stuff that she wanted to remember throughout the day, just like notes like that. It's really, really beautiful.
So yeah, it's this completely overwhelming, huge, sprawling collection. I mean, the beauty of it is as I said, it really is almost as if she's just packed up for the day. It includes everything from a hand-painted Flash to little bits of rag, to unused machine, unused bits of ink, bits for her machines, repair stuff for her machines, her amazing travel box, which actually we didn't see yesterday because it's still in Cornwall. Huge, vast collection of stuff, and it spans in terms of time frame, more or less like the careers of her dad and her. So we have from about 1900 right the way through to the late 1960s in terms of coverage and material and correspondence. After the exhibition closed in Cornwall, that beautiful banner which we'd had on display, which actually we now think, thanks to the work of the amazing tattoo historian Terry Manton, is actually not by her father, but by a guy called Albert Colville Gordon, an American who tattooed in Britain for a while. This beautiful banner, which is just incredible, ended up being sold to a private collector. And a private collector who is very serious and who is looking after it very well. But I was really worried that the rest of the collection would disappear, basically, would get sold off like so many other tattoo history collections have been, piece by piece, or kept in a way that it wouldn't be that accessible or visible to people and historians in the future. So I got in contact with the National Museum of Wales. And again, we talk more about this in our interview that you'll be able to hear on the feed with the social history curator there, Fleur Morse. I got in contact with them and said, look, I really think this is an important collection. Is there any way you have budget or can get hold of budget fundraise to try and save this collection? And to cut a long story short, and we do talk a bit in a bit more detail with Fleur, even as the COVID pandemic was kind of causing havoc with this stuff, we were able to convince the Arts Council and HMRC, the British Tax Inspectorate, that this was a collection that was of national importance, of art historical importance to the nation. And museums like the National Museum of Wales are able to make a case to the government that they should be allowed to buy things with preferential rates. And for a sum which I do not know, I wasn't privy to the financial dealings, but the collection pretty much in its entirety was purchased for the National Museum of Wales and is now going to be, again, as you'll hear more about on our other episodes, conserved, looked after, digitized, so it'll be visible to people on the National Museum's website.
And I cannot wait for people to see these pictures as well, because like this is something that I think I mentioned when we recorded yesterday, that like she obviously cared about photos because the stock that everything is all the photos are printed on is like really good. Like even the photos that are damaged are still like the card stock is still quite strong. So, no sticky back plastic.
Not on those, at least. And we hope that at some point in the next few years, there'll be exhibitions and displays. There'll be opportunities for people to go and look at it as independent researchers and independent visitors to the collection. And there'll be hopefully publications and research work coming out of it as well. Mm-hmm. So, with that said about the collection, let's just get into Jessie's life, really, because I think that, again, is such an amazing story.
Absolutely, absolutely fascinating woman who seems to have done everything.
Fascinating woman, fascinating family. If you Google her, there's not a huge amount out there. What you might find is basically some interviews that I gave around the time of the exhibition in Cornwall, and also then of the first acquisition, or occasionally little bits of writing by Margot Mifflin. But so lots of this story is just, is, if you want to read more about it, watch this space. As I said, it's mentioned a bit in that Ron Acker's book that's hard to get hold of. And there's also a short version of it in a book by a guy called Jeff Jaguar, which came out in the 70s. But other than that, this is really sort of straight from the horse's mouth information. So she was born in Croydon in South London in 1904. and her dad basically lived himself a kind of incredible life. As with, tattoos in general, it's quite difficult to pin down exactly what's true and what isn't. And again, take anything I'm going to say today with some pinches of salt, because all of it is kind of oral history and what people remember, and lots of boasting. And as you'll see, there's lots of weirdness going on here. But basically, her father. I want to read this. This is actually something that Neil wrote, based on some obviously family history and based on some newspaper clippings that are in the collection. So Jessie's father's name was Leonard Collison Lempierre Knight. He went by Charlie Knight or Sailor Knight as well. Mm-hmm. I'm gonna quote here directly from something that Neil wrote on Facebook a few years ago. So, quote, hearing tales of his father's adventures as a captain in the 3rd Alabama Regiment of the Confederate Army in the American Civil War. Already we're in, right? Already we're like, okay, what's going on there? Sparked a lifelong quest for adventure and travel in young Charles Knight. His mother was a celebrated poetess of some repute, and both parents had high hopes for their son. So Jessie's grandmother, her name was Elizabeth Lempierre, and her poems are sort of basically appear quite often in like English sort of sentimental magazines at the turn of the 20th century and right up into World War One. He started off, Leonard did, as an office boy working at a London office in Paternoster Row. However, several weeks after starting employment, Leonard found himself in search of something more exciting. He went down for a lunch break. He went down for a lunch break at to the docks and was persuaded while he was there to basically jump aboard a ship at St. Catherine's Dock and ran away to sea. Right.
A life more exciting indeed.
A life more exciting. So he ran off to sea and ended up in the Canary Islands. He spent 5 years, this is about 1895. He spent about 5 years traveling, all these glamorous ports, Chile, Casablanca, Mauritius. According to Neil, quote, he was shipwrecked in Casablanca, robbed in the Moroccan coast, jailed in Mauritius, went ashore in San Francisco to work in the lumber and saltpeter mines. He traveled to Mexico and used Spanish he learned in his travels to work his way in El Paso to work as a handyman on a cattle ranch. While he was in El Paso, he learned cowboying. So he learned like sharpshooting, basically, and lasso work. Acquired the names Deadshot Len or Two Gun Ricks, which I love. Again, according to Neil, in a deadly shootout with Mexican rustlers, he lost the middle finger in his right hand. Because he was an expert with two guns, he fired with his left hand and killed his opponent outright with one shot. Right, that's the story. Mm-hmm. So he returns home to quote unquote settle down, marries his wife, a woman called Ethel, and Jessie is their first child. One of the things that Charlie Knight had also learned to do while he was traveling was tattoo, and he began tattooing initially through an acquaintance with a guy called Charlie Bell, who was a tattooer out in Kent. And Charlie had basically was also managing this performing tattooed lady. I mean, I say tattooed lady, she was actually only 14 when she was starting to get tattooed.
Of course.
Yeah, and she went by the name Princess Christina, very, very famous tattooed lady. You can, again, people that listen can Google her. And built up a bit of a reputation as a tattoo artist in Southampton, where they were living. So the 1911 census, Jessie's living with her dad and her siblings in Southampton. They moved to Wales at some point between 1911 and 1920. In the 1921 census, Charlie Sailor Knight is listed as an artist, actually, and Jessie is helping him out as claimed on the census. Basically, she is more or less running her father's tattoo shop. She's by that point 17 and a half years old. So I don't know, like, what you imagine, Tom, the life of a portside. Barry was a important kind of docks, really. What you imagine a portside tattoo shop in 1921 may have been like, particularly for an 18-year-old woman to be running the place.
I feel like this will inform quite of the peculiarities of her personality later on, particularly from some of the stuff that we saw yesterday. But like, I could imagine it was just trying to corral chaos. Like, I'd imagine her father's tattooing quite a lot of sailors, quite a lot of people of questionable morals, people who are just here for the night and have some coins in their pockets that they need to spend.
Yeah, and this area of Barry was called Thompson Street, and I've seen it described on one historical resource as a kind of like a red light district, as lots of those portside towns were. As you said, they'd be shops and saloons and outfitters and all the things you usually have in a town, but also things to cater to this transient population. Like, one of the reasons that Jessie's sort of running the shop is that Charlie, he's got itchy feet. He's traveling around. He's also working in circuses, but also shows. So he would travel and perform in theatres and varieties, doing a cowboy act, performing as two-gun ricks, also roping other members of the family in. That's a bad pun. I didn't mean that to be, but roping other members of the family in, particularly Jessie's younger sister, who's called Ella. And Jessie, even for a while, helps her dad out. She's like the target in his sharpshooting act for a while. Ella, who I think there's probably a whole story, not for a tattoo podcast, about Ella and her life. She was initially with her father, and then she married a knife thrower, and they performed together. His name was Hal Denver, and they performed together as the Sensational Denvers. She got shot. She got shot once by her dad. Sorry, she got a knife in the thigh from her dad, and she got shot by him.
I mean, like, could you call that an occupational hazard if you are the human target in a circus act show?
Well, the story about her getting shot, which is in 1931, she basically like wants to continue the show. Like, she's like, I'm fine. It's just a flesh wound.
Gotta love a performer who's got to stick with the bit.
Yeah, got to stick with the bit, right? Just as again, just an illustration of this. This is from a bit later. So this is from 1932. I sent you this earlier on. An advert for the most thrilling Wild West show ever staged in England. Two-gun ricks alongside Ranger Cliff Norman and Juan Santa, Jokoki, G-Wiz, Ella, and Moquiqua. In an amazing display of shooting, roping, knife throwing, and mulish viciousness. Two-Gun Ricks is a Croydon man who emigrated many years ago to the United States. After many years of adventure, he became a member of the Panhandle Co. in Texas in the Ranger Force, and he came back to England to give demonstrations of his amazing skill with a gun and a rifle. Ella is a cowgirl. She's not. She's his daughter. She's also from Croydon. And Moquiqua, an Indian maid. The two are used as human targets by Two-Gun Ricks. And then other members of the family, again, become part of this sort of dynasty. One of the other names that Charlie uses when he's doing more of a kind of lasso show is Rex Roper. And his son also took on that name, Rex Roper, son-in-law. And his partner was called Macy. And they went on to a big career as very, very famous cowboy acts all the way through to the 1970s and 80s. So huge, mad family. And as Neil told it to me once, like, Jessie was the sensible one, and that's why she ended up running the studio.
Okay. Yeah.
So clearly, at least for a while, Jessie's here. Basically running the tattoo studio for a bit. World War II sort of intervenes. Jessie has a sort of abortive marriage. She marries a guy and it doesn't really work out. One of the stories is that she ends up throwing a knife at him, and because she's trained how to throw knives, it just wounds him and doesn't kill him.
I mean, more effective than a divorce.
Yeah. She doesn't ever have children, but she is taken under the wing of Charlie Bell. So Charlie Bell, again, her sort of father's long-term confidant, very important tattooer. By this point, getting on a little bit, based in Chatham, another kind of military town in Kent, another naval barracks, basically. And yeah, there begins to really learn properly how to tattoo. Charlie's daughter Grace is also tattooing there for a little bit as well. So, you know, I've said, you know, Jessie's like the first prominent female tattoo artist in Britain, and that is true. That said, there are lots of women, you know, right the way back to the birth of professional tattooing, and certainly even before that, who were tattoo artists. We don't know as much about them. Sometimes we know their names, sometimes not even that. A woman called Annie Kitteridge, for example, was running a tattoo studio in Wandsworth in South London in 1917. But Annie, like many of these other women, were either the partners or the wives of tattoo artists, and they were, you know, kind of not really the sort of center stage attraction in the shop, so to speak, as the lead artist. Jessie, you know, although she, as I said, learnt from her father, she very quickly became this very, very well-respected sort of central figure of a period of British tattoo history, you know, in the 1950s, when tattooing, thanks to the work of particularly Les Scouse, who ran the Bristol Tattoo Club, who I'm sure we'll do an episode about at some point in future. Thanks to Les and her friendship with Les and the network she was able to establish through working with Charlie in Chatham, and then being in real key important towns for tattooing, Aldershot, another military town, actually where Sutherland MacDonald had begun his tattoo career, and then in Portsmouth, where the Royal Navy base was and where Ron Ackers was based. She was able to really sort of insert herself in the middle of British tattooing. And in the early 1950s, when the London Tattoo Club was formed as an offshoot of the Bristol Tattoo Club, and they were having meetings and get-togethers and little, we'd call them today conventions, I suppose, really. I mean, they were sort of meetings in pubs of tattooed people, really, with competitions, etc. She won, or she came runner-up in the Champion of All England tattoo competition of 1955. You know, it was a little competition between friends, but it's really clear that although a woman, although in a very male-dominated world, and although in some ways we'll talk about, it was clearly difficult for her to be a woman in tattooing, she was part of the gang, really. And I mean, that comes across, doesn't it, Tom, from the photos we were looking at yesterday and from some of the ephemera and letters?
Very, very much so. That, like, you know, she wasn't like this kind of isolated island in the industry because she was a woman. That, like, they were communicating, everyone kind of knew each other, that there was a kind of camaraderie among all the tattooists, and that, like, people were eager to learn from each other, as well as, you know, kind of have some friendly rivalry as well.
Yeah, and she's not, you know, what's interesting about her, and we were talking a lot about this yesterday, so a lot of the really early material in the collection, which had belonged to her dad, from artists including George Burchett, Joseph Hartley, Albert Gordon, and others, these really kind of beautiful hand-painted watercolor sheets by excellent artists. From a time when tattooing, you know, in the era before mechanical reproduction, in the era before Flash, really, when tattooers were hand-painting design sheets, was very beautiful and elaborate. By the time Jessie's career is really kicking off in the post-war period, like, that kind of high-end tattooing, big-scale stuff, back pieces, etc., was much rarer. And the bread and butter work for a tattooer, particularly a tattooer in a port town, was quick. As many tattoos as you can do in a day, right? You've got queues in the morning. You've got your sailors are maybe only there for a day or a couple of days of leave. You want to get as many people tattooed as quickly as possible. And so Jessie's work, she's very rarely doing, although there are some pictures in her archive of larger scale work. There's a beautiful photo which isn't in the collection, but which survives of her tattooing a guy in her in the 1950s, of her wearing stockings and suspenders and a bullet bra, tattooing like basically bra and pants on a guy on a sofa. But
it's
most
great.
of her
it's
kind
a
of
great picture.
yeah, isn't it? Right. But most of her bread and butter work is quick stuff, and she made a reputation as she proclaimed actually on her business cards, and as you can see if you go put into YouTube, I'm sure we'll put a link in the show notes, woman tattooist Aldershot, and there's a little Pathé newsreel from the early 1950s of her tattooing young army women, and just basically bashing out swallows like with no stencils, freehand, just bash bash bash. She's not the greatest like artist in the world in terms of penmanship, etc., but she wouldn't have claimed to either. What does come across in her drawing and the tattoos based on it, and even actually when looking at like the production sheets that she was using and adapting and coloring in, so she was buying commercial flash or acquiring commercial flash from places like Spalding and Rogers, from Chicago Tattoo Supply House, clearly trading flash with people that she knew. What comes across is this real sense of like humor, energy, joy. Like all of her stuff has a twinkle in the eye, and the way she draws women in her flash is just astonishing, especially when compared to the way that other male artists of the period are drawing women.
Yeah,
so, yeah. I mean, again, like this was the first time for you seeing a lot of this stuff close up. What was your sense of the flash, of the designs, of the drawings?
Yeah, like it fit in with that continuity of, British flash at the time in terms of like the iconography, but that point of that you made about how she drew pinups. So like quite often, particularly with this selection that I saw first, it's like it's never really like scantily clad women. A lot of the time it is like women in uniform or women in like very powerful stances, and it's not suggestive at all. It is like kind of empowering, but it is, every single one of the designs, apart from some of the larger pieces that I saw, it's like I could fully see her doing it in like 20 minutes just on someone's leg that's been like standing outside for the past 20 minutes. But like you do, there is
quite a lot of like, nudie pinups, but even those feel less objectified than, maybe a kind of Sailor Jerry pinup that we're very familiar with. Those things that are much more passive in the way that they're drawn. Yeah, most of her women that she draws feel very active, right?
Mm-hmm. And also, like, even in terms of like the compositions of her drawings, like the more like nude pinups and everything, the bodies seem more realistic as well. It's not that like very stereotypical like Sailor Jerry like pinup body. It's like they look like real women.
Yeah, they do. I pointed this out to one of the curators yesterday. All of her women look like more or less like real, actually, like drawings of real human beings, rather than these completely idealized, sex fantasies. Although they're very sexy in many cases.
Yeah, and it's one thing I want to talk about as well is like her as a person, because like so much of the ephemera as well as like signs from her shop where you can kind of see, she didn't like people swearing in the shop. She didn't tattoo drunk people. She didn't really like tattooing women that much, or like young men, and she didn't do hands.
Yeah, well, she's part of this, she's part of this very conventional and quite conservative tattoo community at the time. Like, bear in mind, in the 1950s, tattooing in Britain, but also this applies to the US and elsewhere as well, but it's really at its kind of lowest ebb in a way, right? Like, tattooing had never been completely mainstream. It had never been completely accepted. In doing some more research this morning to try and figure out, how tattooing was perceived in Wales when she was starting out, I found an advert for a tattooer in Swansea called Professor Thomas, whose advert said the curious but fashionable art of tattooing around about 1904, right? Which I think is a good way of putting it. So at the end of the 19th century, first decade of the 20th century up to World War I, tattooing is like, it's fashionable, but it's weird.
Yeah.
the real stigma against it, the real association with the working class and with savagery and barbarianism, like, had been creeping up. You know, we've talked about it on the podcast before, and you can read more about it in other stuff that I've written. But this idea that we have now, actually, that my parents certainly have as boomers growing up in the period that Jessie was working, about what tattooing is, who gets it, and why, is a really post-war phenomenon in lots of ways. So the reason for that is a few reasons. One is that tattooing becomes quite associated with stigma due to the horrific stories of concentration camp tattooing. Jewish people being forcibly tattooed at places like Auschwitz. That sort of starts to give tattooing a bit of a bad vibe. Also, fashions are changing. So the upper classes had sort of lost interest really by the 1910s anyway. But in tattooing, but in general, fashions in the 1940s and 50s, it's when modernism happens. So all of that chintzy stuff, all of that Victorian and Art Deco stuff is going away. And we've all of a sudden, in everything from furniture to cars to wallpaper to fashion, we've got modernism, monochrome, absence of pattern. So tattooing just doesn't fit into that, really. And then the third thing is that lots of people were tattooed during the Second World War, but the tattoos that were visible in the 1950s were not those on the officer classes who were working post-war in banks or in insurance companies or serving in the Houses of Parliament. They were on people who were digging the roads. So if you saw a tattoo, it would be on someone who was rolling their sleeves up at work, really cementing this idea that tattooing was something a bit déclassé. So tattooing's pretty kind of in the doldrums at this point. And for someone like Jessie, that's just even harder, right? And one of the things that Les Scouse and the Bristol Tattoo Club really wanted to do in the UK was ensure that tattooing could claim some respectability in the same way that people like Sutherland MacDonald and Tom Riley had done in previous decades, right? By really advocating for cleanliness, advocating for not tattooing children, although it wasn't illegal to tattoo people under the age of 18 for Jesse's career, for not tattooing on hands. And yeah, certainly at some point in Jesse's career, as you said, one of her shop signs even says, "I don't tattoo women," which is interesting, right? But I think it's also clearly those shops would have been rambunctious. There's a lot of booze around. Some of her shop signs have "Pop Down the Pub" written on the back of them, "Gone to the Golden Bell" in Portsmouth, for example. And when you see those poems that she has up about, for example, if you're 1 over the 8, you're too late, or keep those, watch those dirty jokes, you filthy blokes. Yeah. You get a sense of a woman who is really establishing the fact that she is in charge of this place, right? So she would have been in the 50s. She's in her 50s at that point, as she was born in 1904. So she's a 50-year-old woman. Lots of her customers are going to be 18, 19, 20-year-olds. She's in charge, right? And she's been tattooed a long time. And you get a real sense that there's loads of jokes and puns in her flash. Like, there's a great drawing of a ice cream cone with a screaming mouth with "ice cream" written underneath it. Like there's real fun and energy, but she's also like, she's serious about tattooing and about presenting it in a way that is, that is like, it is legit in a way.
And it's funny because that is very much reflected in, say, like the photographs we saw of her, particularly when she's, all dressed up. She comes across as someone who is intensely proud both of herself and of her work in, both the work that she puts on the skin and how she maintains her work environment, sitting on that trunk so no one can steal her secrets, making sure you can't say any 4-letter words. And, if you're 1 over the 8th, you're too late.
That's right. And you see on some of her flash books, she's written, "Don't steal my designs." And in amongst her collection, there's the beginnings of an autobiography, just a couple of pages that she started writing, and a couple of poems about her life, one of which is called Jessie the Squint-Eyed Witch, to the tune of Popeye the Sailor Man, which basically says that she's like sticking like hell to her pitch. You know, they call me this, they call me that, they call me bitch, and they call me a cat. You know, all of this stuff. So, okay, look, I'm not going to sing this to the tune. Unless you want to, it's pretty too complicated for you to edit in the Popeye theme behind. But imagine yourself. I'm Squint Eye the Tattoo Witch. All the scratch artists call me a bitch. For I cut all their throats till they're burned all their boats. I'm Squint Eye the Tattoo Witch. Right? You can imagine this to that tune. I'm Squint Eye the Tattoo Witch. They want to bump off this short arse old bitch. They know they can't beat me, so they're all trying to lose me. This dirty old lousy old throat cutting witch. They tattoo their eyeballs, they tattoo their ear holes. But a real artist, to this I say, bumholes. Yeah, I'm Squint Eye the Tattooed Witch. They try hard at pinching my pitch. So gristle just like treacle or a small periwinkle. The flotsam and jetsam, the loathful and winsome, the good and the bad, the sane and the mad. May the strangest of noises, unseen but with voices, they whisper their muse of abuse and shout, and it's just like out. I'm Squint Eye the Tattoo Witch. I'm sticking like hell to my pitch. For when I need another, I'll stick to another. For never, ever, there'll be quite another old witch with a needle. The Squint-eyed tattooed witch. So clearly she's aware she's had to fight. She also wrote an amazing poem called, I haven't got it up actually, but a poem called Tattooing in the Atomic Age, where she talks about how tattooing has changed a lot in her career, over the course of her career, but how she calls it the old skin digging game. When I did the exhibition, we did a little version of it at my university gallery, and I called it skin digging because I think that's a good sense of exactly again her attitude to all this, the old skin digging game. But yeah, in amongst that, as I said, you've got this real interesting balance of a sense that she had to kind of fight and earn respect. Other women who worked with her didn't enjoy it and retired, and despite the best efforts of people that I know who've tried to speak to some of those women, they've not wanted to talk about it. The amazing Terry, who we mentioned earlier on, also did some work to make sure the story of another female tattooist from this period, Dot Shaw, got told, because she'd basically completely been forgotten and overshadowed by the guy that she was working with in Blackpool. And again, after she left the industry, really didn't speak about it to anyone because it was so traumatizing. And so when you realize that as well, right, that not only was Jessie kind of the most prominent woman in the industry for decades, but also in Britain, but also that other women that were involved had such a hard time that not only did they leave the industry prematurely, but also they never talked about it after they retired. You get a sense of just what an incredible and special, tough woman Jessie was.
And I think as we're kind of like coming towards the end of the story, I think something that I want to ask you, as someone who, I mean, you're kind of a big part responsible for the fact that all this stuff has been preserved and that people will soon know so much about her. What does her story and her legacy mean to you?
Well, like I said to you yesterday, man, like I think, on the one hand, I didn't do much other than write a few letters and, put some stuff that I thought was cool on display. But on the other hand, I did. And really it was Neil and Neil's fortitude and love and understanding. He wasn't a tattoo guy. He inherited the collection when she died in 1992, basically because she was his favorite of her nieces and nephews. But he understood really that this was an important story, and he'd in some senses kept this stuff safe and together because he knew, I guess, someday someone would come looking for it. And as I said, I wasn't the first person to reach out to him, but I was the first to try and figure out the material story of this material. And I think it's the best thing I'm ever going to do in my career. I've done a few other things I'm really proud of already.
Like starting this podcast.
Like starting this podcast, but hopefully I'll have a good few decades on me yet. But I think this collection now is basically unique in the world. There are collections, for example, and hopefully we're going to get Ole Whitman on, from Hamburg. There's a collection in Hamburg of material that belonged to Christian Varlick. There's a big collection at a museum called Mystic Seaport in Connecticut. And there are obviously huge, important private collections as well. But being able to more or less ensure that this collection stayed together and was put into the hands, as you'll hear when if you listen to those interviews that we did with the curator and the conservator down in Wales, who are looking after it, conserving it, going to put effort into making sure that it's stabilized and isn't kind of rotting away. We end up with the story of this amazing woman and this amazing family, but also I think, of a side of human life, all these amazing women who survived in the terrible misogynistic cesspit of the 1950s in Britain. Something of their story, I think, comes through in Jessie as well, right? Tattooing gets to be the story of things beyond itself, as we talk about all the time on this podcast. Tattooing is not just tattooing is not just the history of this obscure thing, but it's something that from which we can learn about the history of everything else. And I think, the curators at the museum, they were really starting to reflect, as many museums are, about what museums have missed by only focusing on the stories of famous people and rich people, and the kind of objects that are missing from their collection and the things that museums should have been preserving. It shouldn't have really been down to these incredible private collectors and family members to keep this stuff safe. But yeah, they've realized that they've missed a trick, and I think actually the team in Wales were brave, and it was the right time. And although it's complicated and difficult, they really realized that this was going to be an important collection, not just because tattooing is cool and exciting, but also because this is a story of craft. It's a story of the lives of her customers, men and women, whose stories otherwise don't get told very well. It's a story of gender history. It's a story of class. It's a story of, internal migration in the UK, this family that moved from England to Wales, about the kind of cultural imaginary, of this period where everyone's obsessed with cowboys and sailors and the kind of romance, which this clearly through her father, she really fell in love with, So yeah, I'm really proud that basically forever now, until this planet burns up in a fiery ball, there's going to be this collection for tattoo historians and other historians to look at and see and use. And I'm so proud. I'm so proud of it. And I hope, as I said, I can't take too much credit other than being the conduit for it. But I'm glad that I've got myself to a position in my career that I was able to do that, because I think, as Fleur, the curator yesterday, described Jessie, she's iconic, really, not just as a tattoo artist, but as a kind of figure of British cultural history. And it's exciting that over the years now more people are going to get to know about her.
Mm-hmm. And I just want to take, a moment to thank you as well, because, without you, I would have never seen something like that. I said it yesterday that so often as a tattoo enthusiast, you see all these pictures online and you see old flash from certain eras, and to see all this stuff actually in person, to pick up, her tattoo machine, to see all her work and personal ephemera, it was an incredible experience that I probably will only ever get to experience once, and I have to thank you for that.
Yeah, and people will, this is the beauty of it. Things that the museum are also, because of Neil's instructions, because of the way that curating is going, because of the genuine love of how this collection are dealing with everything they own. Essentially, it is going to be accessible. They're going to preserve stuff and keep it in a way that people are going to be able to look at it and see it for decades to come. So yeah, it's really, really, just really, really exciting. Really, I think. I was going to say I haven't managed to pull up. I want to pull up one of the poems because I think, again, it's maybe a good place to finish up. Because it's a good illustration of of this poetic side of her, but also of her attitudes to everything else. So I don't know. would you indulge me to like
of course
read a bit one of her poems? So this is called "This Is My Life." I am a tattoo artist. As such, I won my fame, and I've certainly covered a lot of ground in the old skin digging game. I've tattooed here, I've tattooed there, I've tattooed nearly everywhere. They call me this, they call me that, they call me a vampire and a nasty cat. But a tattoo artist I'll always be. If it's good enough for others, it's good enough for me. That old skin digging gets my bread, so I'll go on digging till I'm dead. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yours truly, Jess.
Incredible.
And she retired from tattooing in 1968. Basically moved into her brother's house in Barry, back in Wales, where she remained until she died in 1992. There are stories of her still tattooing friends and tattooing out of that house, actually, again, certainly for several years after she officially, quote, retired. So she kept her promise, man. She kept her promise to keep on digging till she's dead. There was an amazing filmmaker who recorded her just before she died. Not much of the film's ever been made public. There was at some point a very brief clip of it online. Basically, her in her like mid to late 80s, very old, very elderly, still, having hard time trying to remember everything that the guy's asking her, but she's still got this twinkle in her eye. She's still laughing about people that passed out because she tattooed their necks, and all the things that she'd seen and done. And I think, like I've mentioned this podcast a lot of times, these people that who survive in and around the tattooing industry for decades, particularly in her case as a woman, there's something there that's really about love, about a kind of particular kind of romantic joy that comes from being involved in the industry. I mean, there's a great poem here at the end of her life, or actually not the end of her, end of her career, it's called An Age of Knowledge. And she says in this poem, this would have been, around about 1965, like close to her retirement. 60 summers and 60 winters I've seen, and now I wonder where they've gone and where I've been. For suddenly I feel somehow I've jumped the bloody lot. In spite of all the incident, what the hell have I got? 60 summers and 60 winters and memory lane to wander down and live the dreams all over again, and tear my hair and rant about the potty things I've done, and wonder about the night. Wonder about that, what might have been if I hadn't bought that gun. What a pity. As I said, she shot her husband. What a pity for somehow I think that was my lot.
It's such a beautiful perspective, both those poems on her life and her career and how she thought about it. And yeah, she just seemed like an incredible woman. I know we talked about it yesterday. You asked me, like, did you think that I would have got on with Jessie? And I think we both said that she would tell us to swear less.
Absolutely. So anyone that's listening, look, as I said, the National Museum of Wales is digitising the collection. They're nearly done with the digitising. It's going to be up on display on their website eventually, I think within the next few months. If there are things that listeners can get involved with, we will, of course, mention it on the podcast. Keep listening. At some point, again, soon, there'll be the opportunity to go down and have a look at the material yourself. Some of it would no doubt be on display. There's also, for those of you that are interested in more of the kind of story of her sister and the circus side, there's also material of the circus side of the family in other collections, including the National Fairground Archive up in Sheffield. Remarkable family, remarkable people, and I'm just really proud, to be able to have introduced her to people listening that haven't heard of her before, I suppose.
And if you want to see more of Jessie, definitely check out our Instagram. I'll be posting some pictures that I took, some material that Matt has about Jessie from her life, her work. The link will be down below. Just check it out. Once again, thanks for, this will be a Patreon episode until we unlock it in the future. But thank you very much for supporting the show. It's your support helps us, do trips like that to go see collections like this one of Jessie, and really appreciate it. And thank you very much for supporting the show and for listening. And if this is out on the free feed and you're listening to it in the future, consider maybe supporting us so you can get bonus episodes every month where we talk about stuff like this for as little as £5 a month, and you can get Matt's book at one of the higher tiers. But thank you very much for listening. It's goodbye from me and goodbye from Matt.
Goodbye. Yeah, goodbye.